Good evening, everyone. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the executive director of Charis Circle. Charis Circle is the nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books. And Charis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. Anjali, I think you have an extra tab open. If you can just close all your other tabs while I am chatting it up in here. So I'm ER, I'm from Charis, and I'm delighted to be with all of you tonight. Welcome wherever you're watching from. I see we already have some folks from San Francisco here. And we are here to celebrate two wonderful books. First, I am going to introduce Namrata Poddar, who writes fiction and nonfiction and serves as interviews editor for Quelly. She also teaches literature as well as creative writing at UCLA. Her work has appeared in several publications, including Poets and Writers, Literary Hub, Long Reads, The Kenyon Review, Electric Literature, Catapult, and the Best Asian Short Stories. Her debut novel, Borderless, was a finalist for Feminist Press's Merriweather Award and has released on March 1st of this year from 713 Books. She holds a PhD in French literature from the University of Pennsylvania, an MFA in fiction from Bennington College, and a Mellon postdoctoral fellowship in transnational cultures from UCLA. She's a first-generation Indian American who has lived in different parts of the world before making Greater Los Angeles her home. I will put her social media stuff in the chat so that you can follow her. We were talking in the green room about social media and our various uses of it. So definitely follow these folks. We're joined as well by Anjali Enjeti, who is an award-winning essayist who writes about books, politics, and social justice. Her work has appeared in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, Al Jazeera, the Boston Globe, Washington Post, and other venues. She's the author of the novel The Parted Earth and the essays Southbound, Essays on Identity, Inheritance, and Social Change, both of which we got to celebrate last year. She teaches creative writing in the MFA program at Reinhardt University and lives with her family near Atlanta. And Twitter is her preferred social media medium. So I will drop her Twitter in the chat as well. So I'm going to bring y'all off mute and see if we have fixed our echo problem. Okay, I think we have, which is great. So I'm going to get out of the way. I want to encourage folks, wherever you're watching from, feel free to shout out in the chat. If you do have questions, you can put them in the ask a question box. But mostly we're just going to be talking about these two wonderful books with a special focus on Borderless because it just came out. And we are delighted to have you both here. So welcome. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, ER. Thank you, Anjali. Just such an honor, Women's History Month, and to be talking to my badass writer sister, activist writer sister from the South, and to be hosted by one of the most activist feminist indie bookstore in the South. So just an honor to be here and share the energy.
Namrata, I've been looking forward to this for so long. I feel like we've been circling one another for a while in the South Asian writing community, and we finally now have the chance to sit down and talk. I'm so excited about this. I know we've met in person once or twice through AWP pre-pandemic, but I'm just so thrilled that we get to chat. I loved your book, and I'm so excited that it's out into the world. I remember when you posted on social media about selling the book. So it's been long anticipated for me for this book to come out. I've been reading for years your other creative work. And so I couldn't wait to get this book into my hands. Wanted to see if we could get you to read an excerpt for our wonderful audience so that they can get a little bit of a flavor of what they're going to get when they get Borderless.
I would love to do that. And since we're here in celebration of the paperback of The Parted Earth coming out soon, I certainly want to make sure that we share spotlights on our book. So Anjali, just to give a little sense of structure for our audience, this is what I have in mind. I could read a little bit, and then I'd love for you to read so they can hear what your beautiful book sounds like as well. And then maybe we take turns asking each other questions.
Sounds perfect.
Okay, great. So everyone, I'm going to read the opening to this book. I'm going to keep the reading short because I want to take this rare opportunity to talk to Anjali, but also talk to all of you. And the book, if you read the synopsis a little, on book selling sites, including Charis's, it's divided into two sections. The first one is roots and the second one is routes. And I'm going to just read you the opening from the section Roots, which takes place in a call center in Mumbai, and it's called Help Me, Help You. And this one, I mean, it's a polyphonic, just a little bit more of the context. So the novel Borderless is a polyphonic, multivocal novel. It tells the stories of different characters of South Asian diaspora from multiple perspectives, but this is the story of the main protagonist, Diya Mittal. So once again, the opening chapter, it's called Help Me, Help You. Diya covered her mouth so the American wouldn't hear her yawn. Last hour of answering calls before heading home, switching shifts with Ma to take care of Papa, prepping for college finals, and returning to work the following night. She had multitasked before. She had done night shifts for 5 years now. She could totally do this last hour, she told herself while parroting their airline's policy. Yes, sir, you may carry 2 pieces of luggage for free, each weighing 50 pounds or under. Are you from Bangalore? He asked. One of those drunk customers again, smitten with exotic women. And Chaya, her supervisor at Voice Zone call center, was keeping a strict watch on her performance. 1 week left in May, and Diya had already exhausted her monthly limit of fatal errors over calls. With a toddler and an infant at home, Chaya could relate to his sleep deprivation. That wouldn't stop her from barging into Diya's phone conversations anytime. From Mumbai, sir. Diya kept her answers short and rotated her shoulders, hard as stone from the absence of dance workouts she usually did before reporting to work. She looked at the clock on the computer screen ahead. Your voice is so sweet. Thank you, sir. Have I answered all your travel questions? It had been 13 minutes with the drunkard, 3 minutes past the ideal query resolution time. If the screen timer reached 15 minutes, she'd get another fatal error on her monthly performance and would have to say goodbye to the promotion offer in Manila, her game plan out of Mumbai's survival rut and into the American dream with Aziz. She stretched an arm sideward, rotated her wrist, and curled her middle finger into a Kathak mudra, while others pointed to Aziz, sitting in the cubicle across from her. The hand gestures from her training in dance worked as a code between them when they answered calls. Between their chairs, steel gray carpeting divided rows of gray cubicles on each side of the room, reminders of American professionalism and productivity. Above them, a freshly painted ceiling, as if its golden yellow could infuse life into the drone of buzzing telephones, the sea of hunched backs, and the second-by-second monitored performance of a third world sucking up to the first. I'll stop here.
Oh, I loved that. Thank you for that beautiful reading. And I'm excited to talk to you about Diya and her journey in just a minute. I'm going to read a brief excerpt from my book, The Parted Earth. It takes place over 70 years from the 1947 partition to 2016, 2017. So just about the present day. Tells the story of 2 characters. Deepa is 16 years old and living in New Delhi in 1947. And her estranged granddaughter, Shanti Johnson, who goes by Sean, is living in the present day in Atlanta. Her marriage has just imploded. She's just suffered from a pregnancy loss and has no connection to her ancestral history. She was raised by a white mother, and her Indian father, Vijay, who is Deepa's son, abandons the family in Seattle and moves to New Delhi without actually making it clear why he's moved there, which is strange to Sean because he was born and raised in London and actually had never been to India before. So though most of Sean's section is told in the present day when she's 41 years old and trying to sort through her life, which has completely fallen apart, there is one chapter in the book when Sean is 10 years old. Her father, Vijay, is trying to get their relationship on track. So he brings her to India for the first time and is very sort of openly trying to seek her forgiveness for abandoning the family. And the place he takes her to try to impress her and repair the relationship is the Taj Mahal. So in this scene, Sean is 10 years old, kind of bristling at this time being spent with her father who abandoned her, and is trying to understand what this trip is all about. "I've really missed you, Shanti," he said. She hadn't heard her birth name in a long time, even on the plane ride over during their one-night stopover in London, their connection to Delhi. He'd addressed her by her nickname, Sean. She'd adopted it at the beginning of the first grade, not long after he left them. She wanted something easier to pronounce, something that other kids wouldn't make fun of that sounded more in tune with her last name, her mother's name, Johnson. Sean could be short for Shauna. No one needed to know the truth. But she liked how he said Shanti right now, how it rolled off his tongue, how the TH sound became something harder, sharper, something so different than the way her mother used to say it. "I missed you too, Daddy." It slipped out by accident, Daddy. She couldn't remember ever calling him that, not even when she was little. He'd always been Dad. Besides, she was almost 11 now, way too old for Daddy. "Let me show you something," her father said. He led her around the corner, pivoted her body, directed her gaze along the banks of a shallow river. "See there? It's called Agra Fort." In the distance, red cylindrical towers kissed low-lying clouds. Walls like decorative curtains strung them together. "That's the palace where Emperor Shah Jahan ruled India," he said. "When Mumtaz died, he built the Taj Mahal here so he could watch over her from Agra Fort. When he died, they entombed him here with her." He paused. "Isn't that a lovely thought? He never wanted to be apart from his wife." The truth of this statement stung. The emperor had never wanted to be away from the queen, but Sean's own father had gone as far away from her and her mother as he could. "I never knew my father," he said. His gaze locked on hers. "Did I ever tell you that?" The words fell out of his mouth, landed with a thud between them. His father, her grandfather. She knew this, though how she came to know it escaped her. She always seemed to know about this absence in her father's life, much the same way she always knew of her own father's absence in hers. "I've no idea what he even looks like," he continued. "I think about him every day, though." "Why don't you try to find him?" Sean asked. "I can't. The only information I have is his name." Her father had seemed oblivious to the fact that they shared this kind of sadness of missing fathers. Sean wanted to shake him in that moment. His decision to move to India without her had been a selfish one. He still did not see it as such, 5 years into his relocation, was wholly unaware of how his absence continued to hurt her, how it made her feel so lonely. For her 8th birthday, he had mailed her a globe, the earth parted by latitudes and longitudes, oceans and continents. She had measured with her hands the distance between Seattle and India. 9 hands. The sun never shone on them at the same time. He had moved so far away from her, he might as well have moved to the moon. When he lifted his face, his gaze traced the horizon, settled back on Agra Fort. "Nothing makes me happier than having you here with me now," he said. "No one has ever meant more to me than you." She smiled. Her first of the day. If these rare moments were all they could ever have together, maybe it would be enough. I'm going to stop there. And I'm going to ask Namrata the first question. I'm so excited. Here's her book again, Borderless. So Namrata gave you a little glimpse of Dia and Dia's life. And I fell in love with Dia so quickly, Namrata. She is a phenomenal character. And I love this opening scene. There's such humor in it. But Dia is a very complex character. And what I want to ask you about now is sort of the ways that Dia subverts a lot of stereotypes, I think, of South Asian women. And I want to ask generally, too, about how she fits in and what are the very sort of strict and stringent gender roles that South Asian women are often pressured to conform to. And I want to mention something particularly in the book for this question. When Dia eventually makes her way to California, as you mentioned in your lead up to your reading, she bounces around a lot. When she makes it to California, she forms a community of friends with American Desi women. And what Dia observes is that the gender roles in the US Desi women are just as stifling as the gender roles in India, that this has not changed as Dia crossed borders. This has not changed. Dia had maybe hoped that there would be sort of a more liberating idea of being an Indian woman and what that meant. But she finds that that's not the case. That really resonated with me because, you know, I feel I am immersed in an Indian community, as are you. I feel that that's a spot on observation, and that I've talked about that with many of my girlfriends, how it's almost like we inherit these very strict ideas about what it means to be a woman. What do you think are ways that we can sort of get past this to sort of liberate our ideals about what it means to be a specific gender? You know, we're in an age now, thank God, where we are talking about, of course, more than two genders, that gender is more of a spectrum, that it is certainly not binary. But I feel in a lot of ways our culture, which actually has a history of acknowledging multiple genders, in contemporary life doesn't do necessarily a good job with that. So where do we go from here?
That's a handful of a question. Thank you for raising it. You know, it's always good to hear when women of South Asian descent kind of relate to some of the characters in the book, because it's for my brown sisters that I first wrote the book, even if it's, you know, we as writers, we really want to reach, you know, readers in as many parts of the world as we can. The beauty of all literature, I think. So I think in the book, yes, in the second part that takes place predominantly in Southern California. And that's when also the book shifts in so many ways from her professional quest into a more domestic sphere, which was a deliberate political decision on my part to do that and stay with that space. And she notices that as a first generation, Dia is surprised by how much second generation Indian American women abide or comply or are forced into sort of traditional gender roles as much, even if while migrating, she has a different idea of the West. And she thinks the West has more freedom for women. And then she comes here and then she sees that it's even more, I feel like she has in the book so much of what like a first generation diasporic moment. And this was drawn somewhere from my own history of travels as well, because I grew up in urban India, very middle class, but we were two sisters. I grew up to an academic mother, and growing up in Mumbai, which is one of the easiest, maybe not easiest, but easier places for women to be in India. I do think that in comparison to many other Indian women from other parts of India, did have a lot more freedom. And then when I traveled, so much of my academic research is on stories of brown migration in the Francophone world, of the African islands in the Indian Ocean and then Caribbean as well, both of whom have a large South Asian presence. And then that was my first brush with diasporic communities in a deeper way outside of India. And I realized, whoa, the diaspora holds on to tradition so much more in some ways than urban India does. And then I think California, when I migrated to California, and as you know, I've married an Indian American and I've adopted this huge, large Indian American family as my own family-in-law. And there as well, I learned a different diasporic reality of tradition in the older generation, not necessarily the generation of my husband, like the cousins, but the older generation, the parents hold on to tradition much more. And it makes sense. In some ways, I'll do that for my son as well. Very likely, I'll hold on to things that I kind of, migrated with from India. So I think those are the diasporic differences that get teased out in the book. I try to nuance them with different communities in the book. As for gender roles and us as brown women, as women in general, and gender, of course, knowing that gender is a construct, just like everything else, as is race, class, nationality. I do think our community imposes and expects a certain kind of behavior, right? A behavior pattern, much more from women than from cis men. So those definitely are there. But the idea of how do you evade that? To me, it's the bigger question of how do you evade global patriarchy, knowing that gender is a construct, right? There's so much more awareness now, and South Asian culture has had a much deeper and complex understanding of this idea than a Christian West has, right? In our art, we see so much gender fluid depiction as well, in religion, in mythology, in politics too. Gender fluid community has played a great role in South Asian politics in comparison to Western politics, or American in particular. So, I mean, there's that complex history, but how do we step out and skirt or evade patriarchy? It's like telling fish, how do you get out of water? Patriarchy is everywhere in all its forms, with the rising and growing awareness around gender being more and more a construct across the globe. And I feel that is it's awareness, but it's the everyday, it's the unglamorous everyday activism of sort of, being in the moment and kind of making the right decisions from moment to moment and standing up for what feels right politically to you. That to me is the answer to that.
And you mentioned for our readers that Dia ends up becoming a parent, and I feel what is so common for many of us, and perhaps this goes across cultures, not just Indian and South Asian culture, but that we may have broken out of gender roles when we were younger, when we were single, when we did not have family, but then given sort of the patriarchal system from which family is constructed in almost every country, right? We then are forced back into roles that we had actually escaped before we became a parent, or perhaps for some people, it's before they become partnered, right? Which is interesting. And I really appreciated how you illustrate that in the book, about how, Dia is very, honest and reflective with herself about this, about, she is an extremely independent and spirited and ambitious woman with a long-term vision and a long-term plan. And, I love her sort of restlessness has kind of, I guess, a negative connotation, but I mean it in a positive way for her character, where she wants to try different jobs. She wants to move to different locales. She wants to really experience the world. And does so in a way where she doesn't feel as constrained by her gender until she has a child. And I found that to be so insightful in the book about how suddenly she's backed into the corner, a corner that she had actually been fairly successful in breaking out of.
That's a great observation. I didn't think about it. That makes perfect sense in so many ways.
Hey, you wrote the book, not me.
I know, but talk about like the author's unconscious, right? We're not conscious of everything.
Brilliant, whether or not you meant it or not.
No, this is great. It's always great to hear from readers and sort of become conscious of things that you bring into your work unconsciously. And I think that is that's a spot on observation in many ways. I mean, what you're talking also about, and I talk about a lot, I think, in the second part of the book, but also in my current nonfiction, I talk about it pretty openly, is motherhood and care work. Care work, even in 21st century West, where traditional gender roles might feel less stifling than in certain other parts of the world. Care work predominantly, it's so gendered. Even today, it's so invisible. We are so fighting to be recognized for some of the basics of care work that upholds the entire planet, that births and sustains the planet, and those kind of tensions that come in. And then you're right. I mean, as a spinster, as a single woman traveling, has more freedom than the moment then she becomes a daughter-in-law in a conservative family. So it's not just a caregiver, it's not just a mother, right? But it's also in the hierarchy of family relationships in so many global, I think, communities of color. Where is the place of the daughter-in-law? Not the daughter as much, but the daughter-in-law. So that was definitely a conscious reflection on my part, but for you to sort of, take those observations to the next step. I think that was fascinating to hear.
Well, it's hard to resist that because, we're still in this pandemic, and the pandemic really highlighted how parenthood was such a strain on, it's always been such a strain to be a parent in so many cultures, but especially in the United States, right? And then when we have the pandemic, what became even clearer was how women and femmes were forced to assume so much of caregiving during a major crisis, a global crisis, where we then were deprived of what little childcare we had to begin with.
Right. I agree. I think it's the historic moment. It's the pandemic. I also think it's the historic moment where we are, I feel, with care work. Like, it's a generational moment. I think women of your generation, my generation, so many of us, and I say that in the book in different ways, but it comes up. So many of us were educated to seek a division of labor in the domestic sphere. But men of our generation were not always raised to deliver it. And it's mentioned very directly in certain parts of the book. And I feel like when I teach my undergraduates, when I teach at UCLA, I feel that generation of freshmen, sophomore, juniors, and seniors, it's so much more fluid, this understanding of gender, of care work as well. So I feel like in the next 20 years, hopefully we will have made progress with this. I know, hopefully, with this, with this idea of care work. And I do think writers are talking, mother writers at least, are talking more and more about this. So it's the beginning, hopefully, of better things. That's the idealist in me.
I love it. I hope you're
right. So Anjali, I want to come back to the beautiful excerpt that you read. And I read it, and it just hit so many different emotions. And I was like, yeah, that's the parent. That's going to be me taking Shom, taking back and giving sort of, brief history lecture, but also this idea, right? There's already in that scene, this idea, this quest for home and belonging, and this beautiful moment of unconscious slip with language where she calls her dad daddy. That as well. So, these are to me such classic moments of immigrant fiction. Okay, so can we come back to this idea of immigrant fiction? I was like, this is classic diaspora. This is classic diasporic fiction. And I tend to use the word interchangeably, diasporic fiction, immigrant fiction. But we were talking recently, and I agree with you that immigrant fiction in the US, right, it has such a racialized connotation, and not always a compliment. So can we talk about this? Even if I kept screaming within immigrant fiction, diasporic fiction, How do you feel about your work? Has it been classified or talked about as such? And how do you feel about readers or critics calling it immigrant fiction?
You know, it's an interesting question, and I love this kind of conversation about how we characterize writing, right? That's the sort of the big conversation is, how do we characterize books? Because you're right. For Black and brown writers, it is oftentimes racialized categories that we're put in. Now, I haven't heard yet the term immigrant fiction used for my book. Whether it is or is not used for my book, it's neither here nor there for me. But you know, it has always, I feel like the term originated from white publishing. So it's not so much the term immigrant fiction itself offends me. It's not a term that I really feel a lot of warm feelings towards, because, you know, I was trying to think the other day, when was the first time I heard immigrant fiction? It was, I think, when Amy Tan's Joy Luck Club was published. Not 100% sure. And it might have been like not when the book came out, but maybe a few years after that. Could have been when the movie came out. But I feel like that was the author that I first heard it with. And then I think maybe Jhumpa Lahiri was one of the next group of artists of writers who I heard it with. But the term is interesting to me because I feel like just because a character crosses a border doesn't mean necessarily that the story is about border crossings, right? So it's interesting because in my book, it's a crossing a border that causes, and the trauma from that erupts the entire story. So in some ways, maybe immigrant fiction works better for my book, whereas like for your book, I would probably, like, diasporic literature is probably the term that I would gravitate towards more. You know, simply because even though Dia does cross borders, she's this huge story going on in her life that is much more multi-layered and complicated than that. But it is interesting to me these terms, because, you know, part of my cringiness with immigrant fiction is that it's not used with white immigrants, right? I mean, I don't know that I've ever heard a white authored novel with white protagonists. I don't know I've ever heard a book like that called immigrant fiction. I mean, I could be wrong, but I've never heard the term immigrant fiction used with that. To me, it's always black and brown characters going from a black and brown country to a predominantly white country. So, you know, and obviously I don't have a catalog of books in my head. Perhaps I'm generalizing too much, but so the term is really interesting to me in that sense. But I like the term you use, diasporic fiction or diasporic literature, because to me that almost infuses not just the actual crossing, but sort of what follows after the border crossing, right? All of the layers of identity and culture and, you know, sort of a bigger narrative arc than simply the fact that somebody moved, right? Somebody relocated. And it complicates the idea of a border to me, as does your title. I mean, I love the title Borderless, because, you know, borders are, you know, they're really just geopolitical lines, right? They're essentially, borders are fiction, right? They don't actually, as you mentioned, you know, they are a construct. They don't actually exist as a real thing, only that we politically give them power. And so I loved how your title of your book actually sort of subverts the idea of borders, at the same time talking about an immigrant and her myriad life choices, that some of which are probably influenced by the fact that she's an immigrant, but also then very influenced by her career ambition, by her desire to connect with other places in the globe, her desire to find love, right? I mean, it takes her some time. She becomes involved in many relationships, and has to make decisions about partners and careers. And so I think I'm so excited. We are living in a time of literature where we can have these conversations. It's wonderful. And we can actually sort of critique the boxes that we've been put in and reinvent the boxes or the categories that we want to, and raise our voices about them and discuss them and go back and forth and disagree or agree. But it's a great time, I think, to be an Indian American author, to be in any culture of the diaspora, to be a Black, Brown, Indigenous author, because I feel like through our voices, we've found one another, and we are building coalitions in publishing, and we are really challenging a lot of the traditional notions of genre and subgenres in ways that I couldn't have actually imagined even 10 years ago, to be quite honest. I never thought of these questions 10 years ago, right? I felt very constrained by white publishing. I felt my book had to be in a box. And I mean, I remember all my conversations with agents at conferences or in rejection letters. I don't know where to put this on the bookshelf in a bookstore, right? I mean, I'm sure, Namrata, you've heard something similar, right? I don't know where this goes. I don't know how to market this. I don't know how to sell this, right? I mean, and I feel like, we're challenging these notions of geography in general in literature and what that means. I mean, in recent years, we've had more brown people from authors from the South, like me, and Gayatri is in the chat. Her book came out last year as well. And Nima Avashia, who I spoke to about her memoir about living in West Virginia. So I feel like we're finally seeing one another and finding one another and challenging a lot of these categories that we were once like sort of siloed in.
Let's talk more. I want to hear more about publishing. But firstly, I love the idea of what you said about taking these like constricted terms that can box your narrative into a certain way and then reinventing those, right? So immigrant fiction, it's interesting when we talk in the American context. Of course, it's racialized, but also this idea of border crossing from global south to global north. That's like the key. That's in many ways. But at the same time, like I feel so much of my doctoral and postdoctoral training was also focused on stories of brown migration, but they were not focused in the American setting. They were focused more on the Afro-Asian setting. And it's a beautiful dynamic there because it's south to south migration and back and forth, that as well. So I think I agree with you that these are better times than before to kind of enlarge these categories, reinvent these categories in different ways. But at the same time, I wish I felt the same kind of optimism toward publishing changing. And certainly we have more than one brown writer here today in the room itself from the South, which is great. At the same time, the South is such a huge enclave of communities of color we could so badly use, right? More voices. And this is something I talk about pretty openly in my nonfiction, but also work for Kweli that I do for the interview series, Race, Power, and Storytelling, that with all the conversations that we're having on diversity, publishing, American publishing in particular, predominantly is still 85% white at all levels of executive decision-making, which means the acquisition and the publishing of books. And you and I, we've both been through our own journeys finding a home for our books. Can we talk a little? Are you as optimistic? I mean, I think we're doing better for sure than where we were 10 years back, but I'm not feeling as optimistic.
optimism is a tough thing. Yeah, I would say, I feel hopeful, but at the same time, I feel extremely cautious. When I see folks like Lisa Lucas and Jennifer Baker and Yadan Israel in these senior positions in publishing, I think, wow, like I could not have seen that a while ago. At the same time, I worry about the fact that when we finally get a few people in positions of power, right, and real change power, that we end up just white publishing ends up just dumping the burden of diversification on those few folks. Like that they are actually ending up working two jobs, right? One job is like whatever their editor job is. Right. And then the second job of having the burden of fixing what is white publishing's problem, right? I mean, at the end of the day, it is really white publishing that should be fixing it. Yes. And, I am in a lot of sort of Asian women text chats. And one of the things we talk about is all the times that we are asked to diversify the writing spaces that we are in and how often it happens. And, this is always unpaid work. So it's like a volunteer job to beg people to not be racist about what they publish, right? So to answer your question, optimism might be a strong word. I am hopeful, but I'm extremely cautious. Mm-hmm. And the backslide sometimes is worse than the frontward motion. There was a conversation I was listening to the other day where Black TV writers talking about how many more main Black layered and complicated characters there were on TV in the 1980s and 90s than now. Mm-hmm. So is that where we might end up in publishing, where it's like a few people get to become the gatekeepers, right? A few Black and brown people become the gatekeepers, and then suddenly 10 years from now, we end up back still at that 85% statistic that you just cited. I mean, it can absolutely happen that way. I mean, I wouldn't put it past publishing. I think old habits, it's really, really hard to get rid of them. And I think sometimes the ways that we think of fixing this, and I want to hear your view on this, Namrata. The ways we always think about fixing this ends up being the burden of Black and brown folks.
For sure.
It just never, what are your thoughts on it?
I mean, I also come to the literary world from an academic setting, and I feel the power structures are so similar in so many ways, about like they being very kind of, art world in publishing or art world in academia being very white dominant space. And then you have in every English department, every French department has that token professor of color. So it's an analogy here, but hopefully, it helps understand what I'm trying to say. But you'll have white professors specializing in Shakespeare and Dickens, and then you have the token professor of color who will teach everything from Renaissance to 21st century, all diversity of literature. And I feel that's what in publishing, I feel the few spaces that we have for gatekeepers of color in big publishing tends to be that kind of labor. So that kind of labor has been the norm of the few gatekeepers of color picking up at least 3 times more the labor. So that's one. At the same time, I mean, I don't want to just throw our arms up in the air and say, hey, change is not happening, right? So can we talk, can we talk a little more with stories from our communities of color and then publishing landscape? Where are the spaces for change?
That's a great question. And it's interesting because, we are 2 brown women, and it took a long time for us to find homes for our books. And we both ended up publishing our books with small presses. And so I think this is an interesting thing we need to talk about is, are small presses the places where we are breaking in? Are they the best places too for our books? I mean, it feels to me at least that I would not have had these books published, I don't think, if I had not found small presses for them. I had tried for many, many years to get an agent, and I did end up having agents who weren't able to sell some of my earlier books. Could not get an agent interested in The Parted Earth. I mean, the funny story is that my first novel that I tried to sell many years ago, I had like agents, like so many agents were interested in the book, and I had multiple agent offers, and I went with one of those agents. When I started shopping around The Parted Earth, like I could not get agents interested in the book. Like hardly any of them responded to my queries. They weren't interested in reading the full manuscript. And I was like, wow, did my writing just get much worse since my last novel? But I feel very strongly that small presses do not so heavily categorize books, and they also feel more invested in the story to me than where it fits in a shelf on a bookstore. And we just lost Namrata. All right, I'll talk for a few minutes until she gets back on. My book, The Parted Earth, came out from Hub City Press. Namrata's book, Borderless, 713 Books. Wonderful, wonderful press. And for me, I don't think I would have found a home for The Parted Earth if I had continued on the journey of seeking a big publisher for it. I don't think it would have been possible. And I think for a lot of Black and brown authors, for us, this is where we have to go. Gayatri's in the chat. Her book came out by Mango and Marigold Press, Belonging, which was published last year. That book very well may never have found a home either without a small press. Hi, Namrata. Glad you're back. I just kept talking.
I'm glad you did. I'm so sorry. I have no idea what happened, but I'm back. Yeah.
No problem. So let me ask you this. What has it been like for you to have Borderless come out with a wonderful, wonderful small press that I love? And do you feel that this was the best option for your book?
So starting with your second question, I absolutely feel this was the best option for my book. I love 713 Press as well, just my wonderful publisher and editor, Leyland Chuck, and the kind of books that they have recently published as well. But at some point, we are talking about possibilities of change and structural issues with big publishing. And I did my part of querying because, like you, I worked several years on this book. And we both of us probably gave away the labor of half our lives away for free. The kind of things, white writers don't navigate to the same degree. As well, I think when it comes to navigating these structural realities or inequities, at some point I knew after shopping it with agents and editors, and I did receive a lot of encouraging rejections, explaining, but at some point I knew my book would not get a pass from big publishing. And if you read the last chapter, I think readers might know it kind of calls out the literary establishment in very direct ways. So I did query a lot of small ones. And then the book was a contender for 3 awards for first books, but at the same time, after being a contender for an award, it still was not given an offer toward publication. So it was hard, like with so many other BIPOC authors, right, in this publishing landscape. But I did receive, and I did not keep any track of the numbers. If not, I'm pretty confident I would have given up. So, but at some point, I did. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, just all credit to my Asian American publisher and editor who liked the manuscript, who wanted to take a chance on the book. And I think for most minority writers trying to shop their debut manuscripts, I think, to me, we are talking about change, and I feel one of the bigger possibilities of political change with the current landscape is really where the smaller presses, indie presses, and university presses are. I know my book got to stand on its own terms in this landscape, in this area of publishing, in a way it never could have with the big five, because it doesn't cater to so many of the key assumptions of sort of mainstream storytelling that can be easily translated into a movie, right? And that kind of brings in capital.
I want to get to Gayatri's question in the chat. So, and this actually follows up very nicely with what you were just saying, Namrata, which is, obviously in this book, Borderless, you sort of bend genres, right? You don't sort of, the book does not fit in a neat little category. And can you talk about being, how you did that with the book? Whether were you conscious of genre and the fact that you were not writing a book that fit into a traditional genre, but sort of wove between many different kinds of genres?
Yeah, I never intended for my book to be a novelist. I never intended to be a novelist. I don't still see myself in some ways, but I want to share on that because so much of the idea in my head for a longer time of what it means to write a novel was dictated by the American literary establishment. Even if, as a literary critic, I was working on the novel for a very long time by writers of color. But for my own work, that was like, whoa, I cannot be a novelist. This is not the kind of novel I can write. But I feel we don't get to choose. We don't get to choose the form or the content of our books. Eventually, I think the biggest journey for any writer is to shut up these the voices in our heads, right? And kind of listen to what the book needs to be. And that was my journey in the later half of 17 years of journey. After I had the content, earlier drafts of the content down, then came the question of form. And that terrified me because this book did not want to become many things I had in my head. But at the same go ahead.
No, that's interesting. I was just commenting. No, you keep going. I was fascinated by that.
It wanted to be a novel in different ways. And that what I mean is I never intended to be a novelist because those mainstream ideas of continuity, wholeness, and also character-driven fiction with the psychological drama of one or two or maybe three protagonists, right? Conflict-driven, inner conflict-driven fiction and resolution. I loved those ideas when I looked at the novels as a literary critic. But that form for my own story never worked for me because those assumptions of storytelling, are not universal. They're very recent in history. They're very Western in their origins in some ways. And hence, they also reflect those assumptions, a white male history that is marked, relatively speaking, by that sense of continuity and wholeness. In a way, brown women's histories, brown border crossing women's histories, and especially mine also with desert roots, which has its own historic layers of erasure. My history is not marked by that. My history is marked more by gaps and fissures and ellipses. That's the form the book wanted to take. So when it started taking that form, I went back to putting my hat as a literary critic. And I was teaching. I have been teaching. I continue to teach for about 2 decades now, post-colonial storytelling from across the world. And the moment you step out of America, the borders of a novel are so fluid, have always been challenged by other writers of color. So that was a legacy that I needed to tap into, and I researched that. And I think going back to that legacy then allowed me to kind of take a stance with my own take on form with the novel, if it makes sense. And I call it a novel. I insist on calling it a novel, even if critics have called it a collection of short stories. People have called it different kinds of things.
Oh, it is a novel. It is absolutely a novel. I would take issue with their characterization of your book. So I want to wind into here another question from June, who would like to know how we're taking on the challenges of marketing our books. That is a tough question. I am a little further out. Marketing is a tough thing. So I ended up hiring an independent publicist. My 2 books last year came out within 18 days of each other. And I am also chronically ill, and I did not think I would be able to promote my books at all. So, or at least put into it what I wanted to. So I hired an independent publicist who worked very well with the publicists that were at the 2 presses. That my books, the two different presses that my books were at. I think what the straw that broke the camel's back for me in hiring an independent publicist was that I don't have an agent, and I felt like I was missing a sort of other perspective on how to birth books into the world. So I was very, very lucky that I could do that, because publicists are even the very reasonably priced publicists, which is what I had, are extremely expensive and cost prohibitive for most people. So I was lucky I was able to get help with that. I am also very naturally active on social media. And we were talking about this earlier. I'm on Twitter a lot. I love Twitter. I'm not necessarily talking about books all the time on social media, but I'm on Twitter. I'm on Instagram. I occasionally show up on Facebook or LinkedIn, but I think social media is a great way to interact with readers and to get the word out with the book. And so that's been very helpful to me.
Yeah, I just want to build on what Anjali said, June. I think it's hard. I'm really in the throes of it. My book came out last week, and I am overwhelmed with the marketing or the administrative side of book birthing, which is a big one. Unless, like you said, Anjali, one has a publicist, and publicists are very expensive, even at their minimal cost. So since my book came out from an independent press, we didn't have any budget toward marketing. And I didn't have personal funds to even hire a publicist, given from what I hear, some of the minimal cost is $5,000 to $10,000. That's like the starting range. I didn't have that kind of personal funds to put into it, but I did hire as well. I did hire to work with an independent publicist for a certain amount of hours. I pay her by the hours. What I could do is I could choose the number of hours given on my budget. I didn't have 5,000 I've put in, and I can share this very openly with you, about 1,500, which is a very small published budget for a publicist so far. So I did work for a few hours, but my publicist was great for those few hours that I could pay her for. She reached out to the early readers. And currently I'm active on social media, sort of sharing wherever, if there's an interview or something like that, I do share on Twitter and Instagram. I'm active. I wouldn't say I'm super active, because I'm also parenting a 3-year-old in a pandemic who is very dependent on me and my partner for his basic needs. I'm also teaching at UCLA, and I do freelance writing. It is just hard. At the same time, I try to be on social media and have these conversations as much as possible, because in addition to kind of doing your own PR, the beauty of that is just the community that you build along the way. I think Anjali and I today, we are talking mostly because of the interaction that we've had on social media. And I still remember our interaction. It was not even so much related to books, but it was when I became a mother and I was overwhelmed and I was like, how do I do this? And then we had these conversations. So even as a mother writer, my biggest support system has come through the online world and social media. So it's not easy. It's always easier when you have an assistant or a publicist you can pay for. But I do have a couple of mentees who've helped me a little, and I mentor them in return. So there are ways that you can get a little help, if not as much help as you desire.
That was a great answer, and I'm so true about building the community through social media, and how when you do that, it very authentically generates publicity from your books. We are out of time, so this went so fast, Namrata. It was so wonderful chatting with you. I want to thank everybody for coming, and Namrata, I want to give you the chance to thank everyone for coming, and then we'll toss it back to ER.
Sounds great. Well, thank you, everyone. This was great. I cannot believe we are past 1 hour. Some wonderful questions in the audience, and I'm wondering if we have more time for this conversation, or it's time to wrap up.
Oh, that's a good
question.
I might need. Oh, we got it. We got an answer in the chat. We have more time. Okay. Fantastic.
Great. We'll take questions in that case, right, Anjali, from the audience?
Yes. Does anyone have any more questions?
If not, I'm dying to ask one, but I'll wait for our audience. Yeah.
Oh, Pat has a question. Have book clubs offered support for your books? That's a very good question, Pat. So, what's interesting between Namrata and I, and I'm so happy about this, but things have changed through the pandemic. My books came out in April and May last year, and things were pretty much still only online. I have all my book events were online. All my book clubs were online. I had a couple of in-person events outside, but even people were hesitant even then to do that because most people were not eligible for the vaccine until April and May. And that's when my books came out, in April and May. So I had some book club events, but a few more are now starting to trickle in. I think because cases are lower, more people are now boosted and not just vaccinated. So I'm hoping that there will be more opportunity for book clubs. But I'm hoping too that Namrata is sort of at the phase with her book where, because so many more people are boosted and because people know a lot more about how to protect themselves, that maybe you have had more opportunity to share with book clubs, or maybe you do in the future.
Yeah, so book clubs. I mean, my book came out last week, and this is literally sort of the third event that we're doing for this one. So far, I think today morning I received an email that I haven't even responded to, but so far none. But also because I'm a mother to an unvaccinated 3-year-old, I have been very selective about what I'm doing. I'm not flying out of town. I'm still very careful. I am doing local in-person events, but I'm still exercising more caution than, say, parent writers, right, who have vaccinated children as well. So that's where I am. I'm still kind of negotiating what kind of events I want to take on. How much can I take on even? Because I start teaching something very competitive in 2 weeks, and already what's on my plate is a handful, and it's too early for me to respond or offer a substantial answer to your question, Pat. But that was a good, I enjoyed hearing, Anjali, what was your take on it in a pandemic, especially?
Any other questions from anyone? Any final thoughts, Namrata?
I do. Can I ask a question? Thank you, everyone. I love all the love that we are receiving in the chat here. But I'm dying to ask you a question. May I? Do we have time?
Please, yes, go for it.
So, I have known your work predominantly through your activism and your journalism and your nonfiction. And then comes out The Parted Earth, which to me is a very ambitious first novel, considering that it spans more than half a century and 3 generations of women. And my assumption here being that you haven't spent much time in South Asia beyond maybe a tourist, but correct me if I'm wrong. So in that respect, it feels even more of an ambitious project. And fiction to me is always, and you'll tell me, I'm like curious, was this hard to do? Like fiction to me is the hardest form of writing. I've done both as well, nonfiction and fiction. But secondly, such an ambitious project, right? In history, in time, and in space. And
yes.
What were some of the challenges and how did you overcome them?
So I think it's interesting. This book was written so backwards. So what happened was this. So you're correct. So I have lots of family in India. Well, I did actually. My generation, most of them have left India, but I grew up spending summers in India with family, but I've never actually lived there. But what happened was I had heard a little bit about partition while I was in high school, found the topic fascinating, but we never learned about it in high school. I remember I read a copy of Dominique Lapierre's Freedom at Midnight, and my father forced me to watch Gandhi when it came out, and that was all I knew about partition. So I decided after high school, after college, that I was just going to start reading whatever I could find about partition. I was not a writer. I was actually on my way to law school. So while I was in law school, I started going to whatever independent bookstores I could find. I was living in St. Louis. At the time, there was this giant independent bookstore called Library Limited. And I started buying any fiction book on partition that I could read. And I just read. I read while I was studying for my law school exams and immersed in the Socratic method and taking the bar exam. Got my first job in family court in Delaware. I had gotten married. My courthouse was across the street from a very large public library in Wilmington, Delaware. And I just kept reading and I kept asking the librarians. They just knew me as this person who was reading all this stuff about partition. And I was not a writer. I was an attorney. And after I finished reading all the fiction I could read, I mean, keep in mind that I had to read books that were published in the United States. This was before I was using the internet. I didn't know how to use the internet. So I did not know how to get books that were published in India. So I started reading nonfiction. And then when I started using the internet, one of the first searches I did online was for partition. And I pulled out all these old articles published in the 1940s, 1950s, started printing them out, started keeping them in a file. Again, I was not a writer. I was not writing at all. I never grew up thinking I could be a writer. I loved writing, but no one ever made me feel like I was good enough to be a writer. So I just wasn't a writer. So I started reading. And one of the things that I had a hard time coming across, this was in the 90s, was survivors' testimony from living through partition. I would come across these message boards where the topic would be one thing and somebody would insert a little, well, my uncle, he lived through partition and this happened. But I could not find substantial and comprehensive firsthand testimonies of survivors. And I thought, wow, this is so weird. Maybe I just don't know how to use the internet well enough but I kept reading and I kept reading and I kept reading. When I had my second child, I'd been a field attorney with a federal agency in Philadelphia for a few years. I had my second child. I decided could not afford daycare. My government job wasn't paying me enough to get daycare. I quit my job, and by then I had actually started writing nonfiction, and I was making a decent income. This was before the recession, when you could actually make a decent income for small publications. So I was writing about parenting. I wrote how-tos about parenting. I wrote parenting essays. I wrote humor pieces on parenting, and I sold them to multiple markets. So I did this after I put my kids to bed at night. I had this writing career where I did nonfiction, and I was still reading about partition. Then finally, I started realizing, wow, it's been almost 70 years since partition, and there's still really not comprehensive, large, publicly available archives with survivor stories. Why is that? And again, this was early on in my internet usage, so it wasn't as accessible to me what was happening in other countries. But when Hiroshima happened, a few decades later, there was a giant Hiroshima museum. You know, when the Holocaust happened, there were archives of stories of survivors, but partition, there was not. So in about 2010, still researching partition with absolutely zero desire to write about partition. This is 15 years after I started reading about partition. I came across the 1947 Partition Archive, started by Gunita Singh Bala in the Bay Area, not too far from you. You're Southern California, I guess, and they were collecting survivor stories. Now, there were other archives before theirs. The Citizenship Archive of Pakistan was one. There were a group of research in India collecting stories. But this was a very large archive of video recordings of survivors telling their stories. And so again, this is almost 70 years after partition, right? This is 65 years after partition. And then I started finally reading survivor stories. What also happened at the same time was I started hearing my own family's stories, which were not about partition, but 25% of me is Puerto Rican, and I have no cultural connection to my Puerto Rican culture because of a tragedy that happened to my maternal grandfather, who is the Puerto Rican one, which caused him to be cut off from his entire family. And so when he passed away when I was 6 years old, I lost everything about me that's Puerto Rican. So I'd always had this understanding of how all the descendants of partition who I met would talk about how they don't know this entire history. I could relate to that from my Puerto Rican side of the family, that I have this no cultural understanding at all of Puerto Rico. I can't identify as Puerto Rican, right? Culturally, and this heritage is lost to me. So in 2010, when I discovered the archive, that was what gave me the idea, because I thought, wow, all these decades passed and all these survivor stories were lost. We needed this archive. And so The Parted Earth is about an archive. It is about the passage of time, and it is about stories that get lost when they don't get passed down to descendants. And that's what the entire story is built around. My book, my partition novel did not, there didn't need to be another partition novel out in the world. There are many wonderful, wonderful partition novels. But this one, I wanted to focus on the passage of time. I wanted to focus on what happens when we are cut off from our ancestral stories. Sean in the book does not have any connection to her Indian heritage. And it happens in 2 generations, right? That's what happened to me and my Puerto Rican grandfather. In 2 generations, it has been erased. This entire history is unknown. I didn't even know about this tragedy until I was in my 40s. And so that's why I wanted to end up writing the book, was because I wanted to write a book that revolved around the fact that there was not an archive. There was not a way for this family to hold together, to be connected in their stories and in their lives and their histories until this archive comes into being, until this archive sort of brings everything back together. And that's how I ended up writing the book. But it was like I had done 15 years of research, right, before writing the book. But even after that, I hired 2 authenticity editors. I hired a research associate who collects partition stories to essentially fact check the book. It's fiction. I'm making everything up, but I wanted this fiction to be the most accurate fiction that anyone could read. I did not want a survivor to pick up this book and read it and be like, that couldn't happen. I wanted to know that one could pass from Rawalpindi to Amritsar during the month of July. I wanted to know that that train route was still open. So all of these things I had to know, and I wanted to get the details right. And though none of these stories reflect a specific story of a survivor, they reflect generally what happened to a lot of survivors, which are very common stories. Sorry, I talked for way too long to answer that question. But it was the opposite. I did not set out to write a historical novel. I set out to learn about partition. And then the novel came 15 years later is when I started it. Anyway, and Gayatri was one of my authenticity editors. Just want to give her a shout out to her.
Thank you for sharing that story. It's a great story. I didn't know, somewhere I would have imagined that there was sort of some kind of a personal connection with the partition, but that's a great case for that idea that our stories choose us. We don't choose our stories, right? That kind of thing, that you were doing this research, but you probably didn't plan to write, but this needed to be written. No. Right. And that bridge as well, this is a beautiful historic bridge with this idea of what happens when you lose one part of your heritage. And I relate to that viscerally because of my own desert roots. And we have one grandmother right now in the family. And that's about it. With her, once she goes, that's of our community as well, who hasn't stayed rooted. So I think it's interesting. And I think that's where the beauty of fiction versus maybe nonfiction is, that it allows you to make those bridges in a way that nonfiction, as fun as it is to write, it's a little more scripted that way.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, this was great, you guys. I thought that was a great conversation, Anjali. Yeah.
Thank you so much for having it with me. This is such an honor for me, Namrata, and thank you, Charis, and thank you, ER, for having us. This is such a wonderful platform, and I've had the pleasure of doing a few events now with Charis online, and it always they do a wonderful job. So thank you so much. Let's turn it back to ER. There he is.
Thank you both so much. This was really lovely. I want to encourage folks to support both of these authors and, of course, Charis by clicking this teal button at the bottom center of your screen, and that will take you to the page where you can buy all of their books. And we would love also, I put their handles further up. So Gayatri is so good at modeling this because she already tweeted this out tonight. But if you know someone who would have loved to be here, you can tweet out this URL and they can come watch the replay. So if there's folks living in other parts of the world who missed it, or just anybody who would enjoy this conversation, please do share it. We would love for more folks to see it. I'll also be adding it to our Charis YouTube, which is just YouTube.com/Charis Circle in the next couple days. So congratulations to you both on your really wonderful work. And I know it will continue to find broader and broader audiences. But we're delighted to have found both of you and consider you part of our Charis Circle. So thank you both so much. And I hope that you stay safe and well until next time.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Good night.
Generous audience for a Friday evening.
Yes.